Making it on a regular basis. So here we are. I believe we're recording. Good morning. And oh, I wanted to share a point. Kelly asked a question about are there audiobooks available? You are putting down a lot of pages this semester. There's a lot of reading and more to come. And so if you have access to an audiobook, that's great. And for the Ginsberg, there is an audiobook. You can go to archive.org, and I have updated the syllabus with a link to that. You go to archive.org. I believe you need to create an account for yourself. It is free to create an account. And once you have created an account, you can search up the book, and then you have an option to borrow. You need to press borrow, and then you need to be reading it. If you aren't reading it, it'll kind of interrupt you and say, "Are you still there? We're going to return it because of inactivity." Before you've borrowed it, you can call the book up on the screen and where you can flip through the pages, and there's no audio option. But when you borrow the book, then you'll see some headphones down there in the bar across the bottom below the pages. And then you can listen to the audiobook. So you can, if you're in the car or doing exercise or washing dishes, you have an option to listen. So by all means, give your eyes a rest, change it up, and listen. Certainly, Ginsberg's story is a memoir as well, and it is a riveting one about a woman who is caught in the throes of Stalin's terror. We may not be there yet on Friday, but in terms of having lectured about the terror, but that's what we'll talk about together. You're reading not all, but much of this account of Yelena Ginsberg, Journey into the Whirlwind. So read or listen. And also I'm going to post, I've already dropped them into our playlist for our course that's on YouTube with my lectures. I've dropped in some lectures by Stephen Kotkin, and I encourage you to listen to not all. I'll write up a list as well, but he here is kind of one of the world's foremost experts on Stalin, and so I think you'll benefit a good deal from listening to him talk about that. And again, a bit more of a listening work. But take notes. Take notes while you're talking to him as well. Ooh, let me get you here. Tut, tut, tut. All right. So today we're talking about securing the revolution. And if you'll recall in our last lecture, the Bolsheviks seized power, and it's dicey from the get-go. They declare that they've had a revolution. They ban the opposition press. They say the rights of nations of Russia can self-determine, and immediately a good number of them do. It's unclear what's going to happen in terms of international recognition in the world. It is unclear what's going to happen with the Constituent Assembly. They hold the elections, and then everyone assembles and they promptly cancel it. And then what we talked about is one of the first steps is getting out of the war. And they make the move in a hard position to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in which they sacrifice an awful lot of territory of what had been the Russian Empire. Here is you're looking at a diagram of it. And then, and so then they're out of the war. Russia gets super lucky that Germany loses the war, and in the peace that follows, that territory is returned to them. Once Russia is out of the war, many of its generals, its loyal generals to the Tsarist regime, are then freed up to fight the Bolshevik takeover. And that's when we have the Russian Civil War. So dates on the Russian Civil War are, and I'm just going to go through very perfunctory aspects of it here. The dates, there's no official end. There's no official peace treaty that gets signed to end the Russian Civil War. The Bolsheviks eventually succeed in asserting control and defeating the White Army and then the Green and the Black armies. And so, oh, excuse me. And so there's no official end, but we generally say it's by 1921, it's over. Um, Although there will be some partisan resistance, especially in Ukraine, which had a fairly strong national tradition from, yeah, I think it's important to pause on just momentarily because Russia's claims on Ukraine have created the largest land war in Europe since World War II. And Putin says that Russia is historically a part of that Ukraine is historically a part of Russia, but there have been many people in Ukraine for a very long time that have not seen it this way at all. And I think it's quite telling that, as I wrote in a piece that I published in the LA Times shortly after the invasion, that Empress Catherine the Great in the 18th century wrote about how Ukraine is a separate thing. The hetmanate is its own kind of governing structure, and this is antithetical to the universal kind of empire that I want to run, where the administration is all uniform across my territories. That there's sort of this, there was a degree of autonomy in Ukrainian lands that Russia, well, we won't even go through right now when they get all these, when they acquire the territory that's now Ukraine. It's in different bits and stages, but it's in the late 17th century that the Kiev and the lands surround end up in the Russian Empire. And then in the 18th century, Catherine, she rules 1762 to 1796, very much has this sense that Ukraine is a separate thing, and she has these ideas of enlightened empire, which involves kind of identical administration across the empire. And she says, well, what we want to do is slowly have those structures of Ukrainian autonomy disappear, but we don't want to do it in a way that is going to upset people, because there's definitely a sense of themselves as a self-governing different unit. And so what we want to do instead is at first, insert our people at the top, leave the structure there, and just slowly take all authority from that governing structure, but not in a way that's going to rile any people up. So I think that awareness is quite telling, and contrary to Putin's idea that, oh, these are all just one people. In the 19th century, things get even more stark when the Russian government will issue the Ems ukaz in the 1870s, saying there's no such thing as Ukrainian language. No presses can print Ukrainian language. Ukrainian language never existed. We have right there, like a bald-faced, she doth protest too much. And then there's also the very famous Valuev circular, which is kind of an internal government document that says, like, you must not use these words, including Ukrainian language, in any government document. I mean, it's a bit, you might think about how in the first Trump administration, a similar circular was circulated within the document saying you must not use these words related to gender, environment, and words that we disapprove of in various ways. We're seeing how that's playing out now, but that's basically what the Russian imperial government did was, we don't like this thing that exists, and one of the first things we're going to do is just tell you you can't have this word in your documents. I mean, right now, much of the as oh, we are in a federal shutdown, as I say this um, as we're talking today, and in this whole business of the federal government retracting money from universities, one of the steps has been you have all these people pawing through documents and saying, if there's any word related to DEI on this grant, then we're in trouble because now those have become disfavored words in the eyes of the government. So that's one of the ways in which the Russian Empire sought to quell a sense of Ukrainian nationalism. Succeeded, not succeeded. At any rate, if the Russian Civil War is mostly over by even late 1920, although there's pockets persisting into 1921, you do have you have pockets of Ukrainian existence, partisans that are up there in the mountains and hiding in the woods right up into the start of World War II. And actually, I want to stop. I'm gonna stop sharing, and I want to share just a very brief story. So in some ways, this we get back today. I'm going to show you some pictures of this museum that I went to in July of 2019. So in July of 2019, I went to this conference, and it's the last time that I went to Russia. I went to this conference, and then as we went to the museums in Tobolsk, the museum was about the execution of the Tsarist family. And I was also there for a conference. And so at this conference, I am, I have now flown to the middle of Siberia. I have very severe jet lag. It's in the summertime, so the sun doesn't set. I can't sleep. So I'm in my hotel room and I turn on the television at like 1 or 2 in the morning. And I turned to TV Победа. TV Победа means TV victory. And I'm watching, and it is the Victory Channel is all World War II all the time. There are no commercials for products on this television channel, or at least that I saw watching for the hours I watched that night. No commercials for products that you would buy, foreign concept to an American audience with our consumer society. No commercials, just commercials for other shows on TV Победа, and it's all World War II all the time. And every single show is what I gathered from the ads is sort of, heroic, handsome Soviet soldiers or beautiful young Soviet nurses in the war effort, fighting the Nazis with their own romances and stories. And the show that I ended up watching, was this show about World War II, and the Soviet Russians. They are the handsome ones. They understand what friendship and duty and strength and sacrifice means, and they were fighting against. And the other storyline in this story involved Ukrainian partisans, and the scenes of the Ukrainian partisan camp was you walk into this filthy camp. Dishes are on dirt, rags are strewn around. They're undirty. They're dirty dishes, and it's just a mess, a slovenly place. Ukrainian partisans are slovenly. They're wearing dirty wife beaters. They're drinking in the daytime. There's a scene where an angry, drunken partisan hits a pregnant woman. They they walk by a Nazi signal and give the Heil Hitler sign. They swear, they betray and double cross each other. They are the rotten people. And I watched this in the middle of the night, horrified, because it was the portrayal of Ukrainians was so over the top that I had a hard time making sense of it. And I even wrote an email back to a colleague and friend saying, "Gosh, I watched this show last night, and if I didn't know better, I'm ready to pick up arms for the fatherland tomorrow." And it was so disturbing. And then another colleague who's done an analysis of RT, the Russian television, and this gets into a whole can of worms. We'll talk about this later in the course. It's really a propaganda arm for Russia, the Russian state messaging. And there was, you may have noticed earlier in the news, there have been some Americans that have been on the RT payroll, broadcasting through American portals, really promoting this idea, promoting in large part the idea of, um, why is America supporting Ukraine anyway? It shouldn't be they shouldn't bother with it. Um, so, and also, maybe we need a new world order, that sort of thing. So RT does have a more international reach, but it's mostly a reach in its primary reaches in Russia. And it and one of the I have a colleague that kind of did an analysis of this, and he's saying, yeah, there's really awful stuff on RT, but it's not getting many views. Not all of the stuff is awful, and so we might be overestimating the threat that this sort of a propaganda channel poses. We might be overestimating the effect that it has, kind of that work of detailed analysis. And I share with you these just observations from this moment we're in without having a real conclusion, but I can't help but think about the that kind of centrist understanding during the provisional government that there's no enemies from the left. Let's not exaggerate that threat. The real threat is from the White Army. And it made sense, right? There's no real civil war until all those generals are free to fight a civil war. But in it, yeah, so I just wanted to share with you that, watching in the middle of the night, just addled with jet lag, this show, and then in the light of day thinking, that was so weird. This utter demonization of Ukrainians as Nazis and slovenly and rotten people that beat women and drunkards and that don't know loyalty or faith, so obviously contrasted to these heroic Soviet soldiers. But then I said, well, who's watching that stuff in the middle of the night? And they even said, who's really watching Park Pobeda at 2 and 3 a.m. all night long? So there you have it, just sharing. And this was almost 3 years before the full scale invasion in the full scale invasion of Ukraine. All right, before in this lecture, I'm going to get back to that trip to Siberia, but let's just say a few very perfunctory things about the Russian Civil War. It's fought on several fronts. There's oh, let me return to sharing the screen with you. Not that I have yeah. So it's fought on several fronts. The Red Army is very much the Trotsky deserves the credit for really getting the Red Army up and going. And they are fighting the White Army. And the White Army, they're on several fronts. So there's various individuals: Kolchak, Denikin, Yudenich, Wrangel, and the and Kolchak, who is one of the biggest forces out there in Siberia, he is captured Christmas Eve, 1919, in Perm, which is just west of the Urals. So he's crossed the Ural Mountains. Fun fact in well, yeah. Fun fact, some of the Siberian separatists, if usually people were sent to exile in Siberia, in the 19th century, you actually had a movement called the Oblesnichestvo of people that wanted Siberia to become its own country. And when the state captured them, they sent them into exile, not in Siberia, but west of the Urals. Anyway, so the White Army is the main fighting force against the Red Army, but you also have other factions. The down in Ukraine, it was more referred to as the Green Army. There was also a Black Army of anarchists and Makhno, a very kind of famous, infamous individual um, in this history. And you had a very ambivalent international involvement. As I said, if the rest of the world was America didn't like autocracy, and President Woodrow Wilson greeted the February 1917 revolution as, quote, an impossible dream realized. But the US was not so hot on the October Revolution. The Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, said of Bolshevism, quote, it is the worst form of anarchism. And also, quote, Bolshevism is the madness of famished men. So there were some progressives who were keen. There was one progressive writer, Lincoln Steffens, who wrote, I have seen the future and it works, before socialism was even built. But the more typical reaction was wariness, and certainly the US government wasn't comfortable with the kind of what the Bolsheviks promised. So then there was a question, do we meddle in what's happening in Russia? And there was a bit of meddling, and the UK did launch an exhibition into the North for which the US provided a little bit of support. These are kind of unadvertised, if not entirely secret endeavors. But the US quickly kind of quelled that in 1918, early in 1918. What does persist is there were these Czech soldiers that ended up being sent as POWs into Russia, and they're out in Siberia, and they fought a resistance, kind of getting themselves to the Pacific coast to kind of get back to their homeland. That was formidable. Kolchak tried to kind of form up with them together. It was a little bit unsuccessful, but it was that was an episode in the Russian Civil War. Wrangel, after whom Wrangel St. Elias National Territory in Alaska is named, was fighting in Crimea. He's defeated in 1920. The crisis phase of the war, where Kolchak is mounting such a threat, is in kind of March to November 1919. And now I want to just kind of go back to, so how is America looking at the Russian Civil War? And I want to quote to you a little bit from the New York Times, or rather, it was written that the New York Times, right as this regime has taken hold, so frequently predicted that the regime would fall that the reporters Walter Lippmann and Charles Mertz tallied up in 1920 an article for the New Republic saying that the New York Times had reported 30 different times the power of the Soviets was definitely described as being on the wane. 20 times there was news of a serious counter-revolutionary menace. 5 times there was the explicit statement that the regime was certain to collapse. And 14 times they reported that the collapse was in progress. 4 times they reported that Lenin and Trotsky were planning to flee the country. 3 times they reported that they had already fled. 5 times they wrote that the Soviet regime was tottering. 3 times that the fall was imminent. Twice that Lenin had planned to go into retirement. Once that he had been killed, and 3 times that he had been imprisoned. So all is just to say that if there was unclarity within Russia, the unclarity outside from the international community looking in was even greater than that. So the international community, in large part, they didn't like the Bolsheviks, but they also weren't comfortable with giving unconditional support to the white. That Britain did supply the most money and equipment. Its primary aim is still to contain German power, and that British Empire that has not quite yet begun to wane. That Russia doesn't advance in Asia. Japan actually doesn't like the Bolshevik regime either, and it lands troops in the Far East with the intention of acquiring territory. The U.S. Did dispatch some soldiers, but quickly called them back in 1918 in response to Soviet feels for peace. And then there were these Czech soldiers in Siberia. In all, what are the consequences of things? In all, these international actions did, as one historian put it, quote, little more than reify the myth of hostile imperialist aggression against the young socialist state. And socialist or non-socialist, this has been a running theme in state messaging that we are being attacked by outside enemies. Outside enemies are trying to infiltrate us and undermine our sovereignty. And also this kind of morphs, and we'll talk a lot about this when we talk about opposition in kind of 21st century Russia. This sense of we've been attacked by the outside, we're being attacked by the outside, goes hand in hand with this idea that there is no legitimate opposition from within. If someone opposes the regime, they are some sort of radical that has been poisoned by outside ideas. And we continue to encounter that on a regular basis. So here is just this is a poster of the White Army that they produced at some. I mean, they're mostly fighting, but they also understand. There's always the kind of hearts and minds, soft power of diplomacy. Or, well, the United States seems to be engaging perhaps in an experiment that soft power matters nothing, and that it will be like hard power or bust. But most regimes have recognized that a kind of soft power, hearts and minds element of and is an element of any war, and the White Army was no exception. And this poster here is a poster that they produced, and it says "За единую Россию," for a unified Russia, and it shows a white warrior with the Russian flag standard, slaying a red dragon with a holy Russian city. We see the cathedrals of churches there in the background. So kind of the point there is not too hard to see. And then here are just some sort of lines of where, various fronts of the Civil War were. But uh, no need to pay too much attention to that, but just to notice that the Moscow is at the center and the Bolsheviks held the heartland. So if you were going to say, why did the Bolsheviks win? There was much opposition to them, and much opposition was armed. That these are generals. So how and why did the Bolsheviks win? Well, they had the heartland advantage, and that mattered a lot. And also, the whites had major problems. They were at a great disadvantage tactically because they had disconnected armies. So they can't really coordinate. Communication isn't impossible, but it's hard. Um, the whites had no political base. They stood for monarchy, but the nobility is kind of disappearing right before our eyes. Many people are fleeing, understanding rightfully um, that the Bolsheviks that they would not do well under the Bolsheviks. So many people that fled, could flee, did. The whites had, there isn't, and the monarchists were supporters of the regime. They had no experience in opposition politics and trying to mobilize or organize for politics. So that's so when I say they had no political base, that's one of the things I mean. They also, so they stood for monarchy. Much of the nobility is fleeing. And meanwhile, peasants, the mass of the country, associated the whites with the return of landlords. So the peasants who want kind of bread, land, and peace and to be left alone have no sense that the whites are fighting for them. And the whites really lost support as they moved into the rich agricultural Volga and Ural farm regions, right? If in there people were like, we don't want you, we don't support you. Also, the white army behaved on the ground in very cruel ways and quickly alienated many people that were perhaps on the fence. Their own cruelties went further to alienate them. Their anti-Semitism hurt them tremendously, especially kind of in the in the western parts of the Russian Empire. So Belarusia, Ukraine, you had a significant Jewish population. Why did you have such a significant Jewish population there? The Pale of Settlement was actually the first time that the Russian Empire really had a substantial amount of Jews was when it acquired what became known as the Pale of Settlement during the partitions of Poland that happened from 1773 to 1795 in three kind of very cynical diplomatic moves that made Poland disappear from the map. And it's then that you start to have Jews in Russia. Why? Well, for much of medieval and early modern history, Jews were expelled from Western European places. They weren't allowed to own land, so they were maybe forced into cities where in order to get by, you need to be able to, count and have numeracy and literacy and get involved in business. And this is one of the things that contributed to the tropes of Jews being globalist, networked business people. Well, that's because they weren't allowed to, become farmers in Western Europe, and they were often expelled. And but they did settle in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and often because they had numeracy skills, sometimes not all Jews. You had Jewish peasants in the Pale of Settlement, but many Jews were put in the positions of being the bailiff or the manager on these landlorded estates during what is known as the Second Serfdom, which is just that as Western Europe is, this urban cities are exploding. It's having such commercial growth in the late early modern period. It needs more grain. And it's getting a lot of it from Western Europe, sorry, from Eastern Europe. And so you have what's called this second serfdom, these grain producing areas in, Belarus, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and Russia. And it is often Jews that are in the role of bailiffs. And thus, they are the people delivering. If the landlord up above and unseen is kind of calling for what amounts to a squeeze on the peasants, it's the Jewish managers that are in the role of implementing the landlord's squeeze. And this contributed to hatred and some of the anti-Semitism from below that we find in this part of the world. And when in the late 19th and early 20th century the pogroms come, it's in this part of the world that they're happening. So that's just a little bit of a diversion into kind of the social history of that region of the Russian Empire, and that contributes importantly to us understanding why the White Army didn't find too much allegiance there. They are associated, as so much of the Russian elite were, with a real and some often viral anti-Semitism. So other problems that the whites had, they have the internal problems. There's kind of too many generals. They have supply problems. They lost popularity when they requisitioned grain. And also their supply problems included venality. Supplies aren't going to the wrong place. Vodka, cocaine abuse is rife among officers in World War I. It's a big part of the story of World War II. Well, it's there in World War I too. And so the whites have do not succeed in mobilizing an anti-Bolshevik movement among local populations in large part. There's also the Civil War this was a chaotic and confusing time. Sometimes, even when we read Dr. Zhivago, right? And there's these partisans and what do they stand for? And you don't really have a very good sense of it. Well, neither did people on the ground. And I want to share with you one quote that was a partisan group in Siberia issued the following proclamation during the Civil War. I'm going to read this proclamation. Quote, "It is time to finish with the destroyers of Russia, Kolchak and Denikin, who are continuing the work of the traitor Kerensky. The Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich has arrived in Vladivostok and taken power over Russia. He has commanded me to raise the people against Kolchak. Lenin and Trotsky in Moscow have subordinated themselves to the Grand Duke and been appointed as his ministers. I call on the Orthodox people to take up arms for the Tsar and Soviet power." What a mashup of allegiances, right? I mean, you can't get you can't get too much more inconsistent than that. Reminds me of Daniel Webster's remark, consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, but no, I think I bring that remark inappropriately. This is just a complete mashup for the czars and Soviet power. For the Grand Duke and Lenin and Trotsky will oust Kerensky and Kolchak and Denikin. It was Kerensky that he had his own mismanagement, but he's the one that says, "Hey, watch out for Kornilov and kind of a monarchist takeover," right? So this illustrates the very confused nature of the Civil War out in Siberia, at least, and we could marshal the same sorts of inconsistencies around the region, probably. So, so if you feel confused that you don't have all this sorted out, you're not alone. But note how different that sort of a get out and fight is from someone like Lenin, splitting hairs over theoretical orthodoxies about party membership or um, when the revolution moves forward and how. All right. So, what is the regime doing? Well, the regime needs an army. How are we doing on time? The regime needs an army, and Trotsky is largely the one who is at the head of building it. It requires a major bureaucratic organization. In 1920, by 1920, Trotsky has organized an army of 5 million soldiers. 1 million will defect to the whites, but the army, it does become quite effective and it becomes an enlightenment tool, especially since the proletariat has been all but peasantized after the war. And and so what we start to see is the emergence of a Marxist state. It's a new type of a state, it's a new type of economy. Entire classes are disenfranchised as bывшие люди, past people, right? This is who gets to be included? Past people. You are no longer a person in this regime. Talk about dehumanizing when we call you bывшие люди. That means like no longer. Бывший, был is in the past. There's a brutalization of public life between the Russian Revolution and then the Civil War, and famine comes, and the Bolsheviks very much have this mentality. You are with us or against us ethos. They, among their own ranks, there's a sort of toxic masculinity of we're going to be tough. We wear these black leather jackets, and 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 this sense of we're not guilty of doing anything wrong. All of this, we are following the logic of history. They have a revolutionary ideology. We are following the logic of history. And so this strange combination of ideology and circumstance pushes the Bolsheviks to extreme policies that they will continue after the war. As some historians have put it, you know, why did things go so wrong, right? If we can agree that what the Soviet Union ends up being certainly wasn't what Marx imagined in the quiet of the British Library. And one of the suggestions is that things went so wrong partly because it was the Bolshevik regime was forged in wartime and in violence and forged in the crucible of war. It became a violent operation and couldn't quite escape from that fate. We have to wrap up there. So we will talk about Yelena Ginsburg's journey into the whirlwind on Friday. All right, have a good rest of the day.